I would like to talk to you about the economic future of the country, because I remain convinced, as I have. I was convinced of this in World War II. I was convinced of it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 9/11, the financial crisis, that nothing can basically stop America. And we've faced great problems in the past. We haven't faced this exact problem. In fact, we haven't really faced anything that even quite resembles this problem. But we faced tougher problems, and the American miracle, the American magic, has always prevailed, and it will do so again. And I would like to take you through a little history to essentially make my case that if you were to pick one time to be born and one place to be born, and you didn't know what your sex was going to be, you didn't know what your intelligence would be, you didn't know what your special talents or special deficiencies would be, that if you could do that one time, you would not pick 1720, you would not pick 1820, you would not pick 1920. You'd pick today, and you would pick America. And of course, the interesting thing about it is that ever since America was organized in 1789, when George Washington took the oath of office, people have wanted to come here. Can you imagine that? You know, for 231 years, there's always been people that have wanted to come here. Now, my friend, I think has jumped the gun just a shade on putting up slide one, but I'm going to call from some slides as we go along. But the interesting thing about this country is what is on slide one. Let's put it up. And this is an extraordinarily young country. Now, I'm comparing it to a couple of guys that are pretty old, but when you think about the fact that my age, Charlie's age, or our life experience, and then we'll throw in this young guy over here, Greg Abel, and if our life experiences combined exceed the life of the United States, we are a very, very young country. But what we've accomplished is miraculous. Now, just think of this little spot in history. And if we'll go to slide 2, I've tried to estimate. Well, let's go back and we stay with slide 2. But the population in 1790, we had 3.9 million people here. Incidentally, when you look up census figures, you find out that they had a big fire in the Department of Commerce building in 1921, so they lost a lot of the census records. So these are not quite as there's some things where there's a few gaps, but there were 3.9 million people in the United States. And actually, I've got 0.6 million. It's closer to 0.7 million. There were 700,000 of those people were slaves at the time. But those 3.9 million people were 0.5% of the population of the planet. And if you'd asked any of those 3.9 million people, any of them, to imagine what life would be like 231 years later, even the most optimistic person, and let them think times, Charlie over here, Greg Abel, And if our life experiences combined exceed the life of the United States, we are a very, very young country. But what we've accomplished is miraculous. Just think of this little spot in history. And if we'll go to slide 2, I've tried to estimate. Well, let's go back and we stay with slide 2. But the population in 1790, we had 3.9 million people here. Incidentally, when you look up census figures, you find out that they had a big fire in the Department of Commerce building in 1921, so they lost a lot of the census records. So these are not quite as there's some things where there's a few gaps, but there were 3.9 million people in the United States. And actually, I've got 0.6 million. It's closer to 0.7 million. There were 700,000 of those people were slaves at the time. But those 3.9 million people were 0.5% of the population of the planet. And if you'd asked any of those 3.9 million people, any of them, to imagine what life would be like 231 years later, even the most optimistic person, and they could have been drinking heavily and even had a little pot, and they still could not in their wildest dreams have thought that in 3 lifetimes, Charlie's, mine, and Greg's, that in that period, you would be looking at a country with 280 million vehicles shuffling around its roads. Airplanes, maybe not today so much, but they'll be back again. And they were flying people at 40,000 feet, coast to coast in 5 hours. That great universities would exist in one state after another, great hospital systems, and entertainment would be delivered to people in a way nobody could have dreamt of in 1790. This country, in 231 years, has exceeded anybody's dreams. I went to the internet and trying to prepare for this, and I tried, if you'll move to the next slide, I tried to find out what was the wealth of the country in 1789, our starting point. And I punched in United States wealth. I tried 1789, I tried 1790. I thought it might be a little easier in terms of a round year. And I think 4 million or so references came up. And I didn't look at all 4 million. But I can tell you, the data collection in those early days on many fronts was not anything like today. You really can't find what I would consider reliable figures. You can find out how many mules there were in the country and a few things like that, and trying to add them up. But in real estate, when you're looking at houses or apartment houses or office buildings, that they're each slightly different than each other, but they look to comparable sales. So it's hard to find a lot of countries that have been sold where the wealth has been estimated. But it was interesting to go back and think about the fact that in 1803, we purchased for $15 million. We made the Louisiana Purchase. Now that's a little later than 1789, but that's the best comp, as they say in real estate. That's the best comp. we could find for land mass anyway. And when we purchased, made that purchase, that was equal, incidentally, to about a quarter, about 800,000 plus square miles. But it was about a quarter of what the lower 48 states now contain. So we bought about a quarter of the lower 48 for this $15 million back in 1803. And if you live in Texas and your grandfather is close to dying, and he calls the children around him, and in his final words, he always says, "Don't sell the mineral rights." Well, the French sold us the mineral rights on that $15 million deal as well. So we got that whole strip there. We got all of Kansas and essentially all of Oklahoma, and they produced 21 billion barrels of oil for us and a lot of natural gas since the purchase. One of the sidelights is that we paid our $15 million for the Louisiana purchase. We paid $3 million of it, 20% of it. We paid with 200,000 ounces of gold valued at $15 an ounce, and that $3 million that the French took. And we got South Dakota as part of the Louisiana purchase, and the Home State mine up there, before it closed, produced well over 40 million ounces of gold, and 40 million ounces of gold, and comes to about $60 billion worth. And like I say, 200,000 ounces took care of 20% of our purchase price. So the Louisiana purchase was a bargain, but it's what the going price was for 800,000 square miles, I guess, at the time, and 3 cents an acre. And so I decided, by playing around with various numbers such as that it, as a reasonable estimate of the worth of the country in 1789, $1 billion was not a crazy figure. Now, if I'd been an academician or something, I would have put $1,107,400,000 or something like that, or I would have made it look respectable. But it's a wild guess. But it's not a crazy figure. So what has happened? Let's move on to the next slide. To the wealth of the country since then. And here we have some figures that come out pretty regularly. Well, they do come out regularly, where the Federal Reserve estimates the net household worth of people in the United States, all the households in the United States. And you can look these up, and you'll see that there's 30 trillion of stocks and or so owner-occupied single families, and maybe 45 million rental apartments and so on. So you start adding all these up, and the Federal Reserve tells us, and I invite you to look at the data, it's kind of interesting, that we now, in the United States, 231 years later, we have 100 trillion, we have more than 100 trillion of household wealth,